Om Haranmaye Parikosya Virajan Brahmaniskalam. Tachu Brahm Jyotisham Jyoti Tadyadatma Vido Viduhu. Shining like burnished gold, highest and deepest. Taintless, ever pure. The essence of everything, which all beings seek, whether knowingly or unknowingly. There shines Brahman. It is that which the Guru teaches, and it is that which the wise ones exult in. Om peace, peace, peace. Om yo brahmanan vidadati purvam, yo vaivedamscha prahino hitasmai, tanhadevat mabudi prakasha, mumokshurvai sharnamaham prapadye. Om Shantihi, Shantihi, Shantihi. That one nameless and formless presence, out of which sprang the sacred Trinity at the beginning of a cosmic cycle, who is a bridge to immortality, who delivered the 4 Vedas unto Lord Brahma, who is partless, actionless, faultless, and divine, who resembles fire that has consumed all its fuel. I go for refuge to that one Supreme Brahman, whose light turns the understanding of mankind to the Atman, the indivisible self in all. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Sahana, Om Sahana Vavatu, Sahanau Bhunaktu, Sahaviryam Karvavahai, Tejasvi Navaditamastu Ma Vidvishovahai. Om Shantihi, Shantihi, Shantihi. May Brahman, divine reality, protect us, and may Brahman sustain us. May Brahman also illumine our thinking process. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, or with the teachings, and may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om. We are here broadcasting to all of you on the live streaming on Sunday, as is our day in Hawaii. We also broadcast on Saturdays and Sundays when we are at the Portland ashram and San Francisco ashram in the old days. But now, because of the COVID and the social distancing and everything, we're having to cancel many of our mainland excursions, dharma visits we call them, and give classes here on Sunday as usual to all of you who are watching. So we welcome the live streaming audience. Yesterday, Saturday, we had a couple dozen of you on satsang in the morning, which was very heartening to see. All of us here on the Big Island are a small sangha of some 6 or 8, although more are coming over the next couple months to join us in our endeavor here in the Hawaiian Islands to broadcast the Dharma to all points on earth, as we've been doing in many different ways and forms for the last 25 to 30 years, and for most of our lives really in our practice phase. Although practice phase hardly ever ends for even the great beings, as Sri Ramakrishna said. Don't call me a master, he said. that word pricks my flesh. It assumes or presumes that I've left off, I've reached the end of knowledge and learning. I suppose you could say the enlightened beings have reached the end of knowledge, as it contrasts to ignorance anyway, and have transcended lower knowledge and probably even dharmic knowledge. But transcendence there means they can always come back to it and utilize it to help others, which is their penchant. Loka sangraha is the Sanskrit term for that in the Gita by the Lord Sri Krishna, when he talks about being of highest help for the good of all living beings. Lokas means all the worlds, not just this physical one, but all the worlds inside of us, the kingdoms of heaven within us, the akashas, as we were talking about yesterday at satsang, how the koshas occupy the akashas, if you want to bring together those two other quintuplication teachings. Everything spilling out in fives, the great rishis said. So all the way down to the 5 elements, back that up to the 5 senses, and then the 5 subtle senses in dream, the 5 subtle elements that give rise to called the tanmatras, that give rise to the gross elements. And then what I like to call the 5-fold mind, usually called 4-fold, but if you add the Lord's mind, Mahat, in there, then you have a 5-fold mind. So you see this spilling out of tattvas with consciousness accompanying. I've always talked about it as like take a step, you have to make sure there's, like a step on a lake, you have to make sure there's a rock there, and then another rock, and then another rock. You can make your way across the brook or the river or the lake. So consciousness provides itself with these tattvas, or principles, which are manufactured out of its own mind, solidified things, like the thought of water, and then water itself, and the thought of earth, and then earth itself. So we're always thinking interior consciousness, not back in time or up in space in Vedanta, but how everything came from the one down to the two through the many. And the only risk in that is or we were talking about it in terms of a challenge, was to try and keep your consciousness unfragmented, indivisible, like the Lord, like your Father, like your Mother, Divine Mother, and the Lord, great Lord of the worlds. They keep their mind unfragmented, unbroken, their consciousness homogeneous and flowing, without breaks, and hopefully not mixed in with other alloys that will cause the soul to have to enter into phases of purification. My teacher used to say, if we all knew that we were the Atman, then we would never have to do any spiritual practice. And of course, to those of us who are hearing that in our 20s and 30s and so forth, myself and like 6 in our SRV founder, we found that a kind of stunning statement. Wow, not have to do spiritual practice? And of course, the Advaitic truth around that, or behind that, is that all is perfect, all is one, all is ever peaceful. Like Gaudapada says in his Karika, it's all just innately peaceful, that's its nature. So why did I lose that peace? How did my mind become fragmented? Now I have to do yoga, 8-limbed yoga. Make sure to insert that in here, because Hatha Yoga will not take you back to the source, except the source of matter, flesh, and so forth. So make sure you do the practice with the 8-limbed yoga. It's a great teaching by Vedas, which we'll see here on one of these quotes on our charts about the 2 purposes for yoga. But beings who come into the embodiment process, providing the tattvas for themselves, they're not doing so with a fragmented mind, so those imperfections aren't in their world, not in their consciousness or in their intelligence. Their projections are perfect and peaceful, and not accompanied by desire. That's called aptakama. It's a name for Lord Shiva too. It's free of all desires, aptakama. which of course would be Sri Krishna's state too if he were trying to embody for the purposes of loka sangraha. He would also be apta kama. He has no desire for anything except that the soul be in this pure and perfect state. So it's fitting to talk about this to start out today, because we're looking back some months or almost a year to where we were giving teachings on the Akshi Upanishad. Akshatam is that refers to this third eye, Akshi. And the Akshi Upanishad then gives us these teachings from the Sun God. And we have been studying that for a couple years in Portland, Oregon, on my 4 times a year visit, until we had to cancel those because of the recent virus epidemic, they're calling it. So we haven't then taken up the Akshi Upanishad, and we will decided, since we have these 2 Sundays here, where we would usually be in Portland and San Francisco at this time of month, and we're staying home here in Hawaii. Not a bad fate for us, by the way, to stay home in Hawaii. But since we would have been giving the Akshi Upanishad classes in Portland, then we're going to give them on these 2 Sundays. That is today and next week. So all of you who are tuning in for that, who have been looking forward to it, because it's such a wonderful Upanishad and doesn't get much attention. And that brings me here to the chart that is on my right. If we look at it, we can see, just to give us a you are here kind of perspective. You've seen those star maps where you have all these stars and there's an arrow pointing to Earth. There's the Earth's moon, you see, and sun. So you are here on that big star map. So this is a spiritual star map here where you see all the Upanishads listed. I finally got it all together and referenced 2 of the great scriptures of India, one Vedic and one Tantric, as to see what the list of Upanishads, the definitive list, was, and separated them into the 4 Vedas. So that's why I just chanted at the beginning of this class, who delivered the 4 Vedas unto Lord Brahma. So that's this living intelligence called Brahman, in a non-personified, transpersonal way, as living intelligence, just sprang out of the seeds of Lord Brahma's great mind, the Mahat, if you want to call it that, or the cosmic trinity. And so just like knowledge comes out of you seemingly from nowhere when it's perked or pricked or called out by powerful words, for instance, just in that way too, all these seeds of the whole Kalpa and Mahayuga are lying there with the gunas in abeyance and the prana stilled and quiet, and it's like a hawk in its nest, all laying there in that great mind, ready to proceed with the next projection. We like to say the next projection, rather, although using the word creation is a tongue-in-cheek way of expressing that, because people are used to that. Seems like something gets created, but it only gets projected from the mind. That's why it can never be destroyed, because it doesn't get created. And you can never die because you were never really born, because you're not the body. That reminds me of the 2 God blogs I just put up on our new website. One of them's called, I am not the body, but I have 3 of them. So you have your gross and subtle and causal bodies that India's known about forever, but in the West we only think one body. And the other one's called A Soul is Not Created. So you can look into that if you want to understand this distinction between the words projection and creation. If you want, projection and withdrawal is the Divine Mother's 2 hands, and inside of that is this tempest in a teapot called creation, preservation, and destruction, presided over by the Trinity. And so they're watching things come into, bringing things into being, watching them over cycles of time, and then dissolving them back. Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva's powers under the auspice of these 2 great hands of Divine Mother Shakti, Mahashakti. So those ideologies or great cosmological teachings are what's called dharma. And a lot of that is found as a source back in the Upanishads. So the Vedas divided into 4 Upanishads. I want to show you that really quick. We're not going to go through them all. I'll just show you where you are on the star map. And then we'll take a teaching on the orthodoxy of and non-orthodoxy of darshanas in India. As we were just speaking about that on the way over here on our drive to Kedarnath here, we call this center. Well, and how looking back into the teachings of India, it's the only place in the world that you can look at so many facets of Dharma and just call it one religion. And that they all are concurring with each other and playing off each other, like Sankhya, the Vedic period, the Tantras early in the Indus River Valley, the Tantric cultures and so forth, and finally pretty much then, Ram and Krishna as avatars, and then after that you've got Buddha and Patanjali's yoga and Shankara and Gaudapada, generally kind of 500-year steps apart in time, what we call time, right to Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother today, with Chaitanya being some 500 years prior to that, and Shankara 500 years prior to that, and Patanjali 500 years prior to that, all roughly speaking, give or take a few dozen years. So all of this in India, I'm saying, is this how you can look at all these darshanas of India and just look at them as facets of one jewel. Hard to do that with, say, all the schools of Christianity when the Catholics and Protestants have been at war for 200 years with each other. And actually physical war, this is, in many cases. So when you're looking at India, you're looking at something very unique to the world and to time overall. And we'll look at that closer, but just back to the star map here, it's always worth reading the take of Swami Vivekananda when he came here to the West and saw this warring factions of different religions, schools that couldn't get together and couldn't support one another. And we're not thinking in terms of one Sanatana Dharma. And also didn't have a non-dual philosophy behind them, except just little glimmers occasionally, like Meister Eckhart and Ecclesiastes and some of the Romans and Greek philosophers, some glimmerings of non-duality starting to occur to these minds. But it was always there as the underlying foundation in India from the get-go, before this Trinity even projects a whole cosmic cycle. It's there as a seed. So it's beautiful to look at India's darshanas that way, and we will. But you can see this way in which Vivekananda put it. Every time we bring up this chart on the Upanishads, it's nice to read it. Sober-minded beings have become disgusted with their superstitious religions and are looking to India for new light. By the way, this whole class today and next week is about light. It's about the sun god. Light is intelligence, living intelligence, and it turns into suns, billions of suns later at the material level. But you follow fire back in its history chronologically, even on Earth, but, as big bangs and lava and things, but back interiorly to intelligence, and you'll find out it's all about light. And that's why I chanted today the two Hairan Mai Pari Korshi Virajan Brahmanishkalam Tachu Brahm Jyotisham. Jyoti is light. And then talking about the light of Brahman in Tan Hadeva Atmabudhi Prakasha. There's this light of intelligence. So we'll look at the sun god, who his makeup, how he's the one that's teaching the Akshi Upanishad to the rishi who repaired within and found him. Oh, there you are, you see, the light of lights, the sun god, Surya Narayan. Now I found you. Tell me about light. Tell me about how all of this is done. how this sleight of hand of Maya turns into things out of nothing, apparently, and asks him all the questions he wants. So they become disgusted with their superstitious religions that have become benighted, darksome, and they're looking to India for new light. How eagerly they take in any little bit of the grand thoughts of the holy Vedas, which resist and are unharmed by the terrible onslaughts of modern science. The theories of creation out of nothing, a created soul, of the big tyrant of a God sitting on a throne in a place called heaven, and of eternal hellfires have disgusted the educated. And the noble thoughts of the Vedas about the eternity of creation and of the soul, they are imbibing fast in one shape or another. So, setting them off against each other, this fundamentalist view of both religion and science, that is, what you could call irreligion nowadays, and science on one side, and then on the other, this eternal religion of Sanatana Dharma, in just a few sentences, how he could bring light, as if he was the sun god himself coming from India in the Kali Yuga to shed some light here for us, and finding some people here that are disgusted with superstition and fables and myths and old archaic sayings like God breathed life into the soul. The soul is God. How can it breathe life into itself? So you have to then look at the non-dual position that has been taken by the seers of India from time out of mind, really. It's a nice phrase, time out of mind. Like when you get out of your mind, time stops. When you get back into your mind, it begins again. And you're in deep sleep or in samadhi, beyond time. So that's a very nice way of saying, and when it's said here, the theories of creation out of nothing, a created soul, and so forth. Just today I was on our new website, srvwisdom.org, that you can look up and become a member of, and one of my students had posted this new scientific discovery with a turban kind of image there going around in cycles, and he had, the scientist is proclaiming that there is no beginning and no end to the universe. The end of the universe, there was no Big Bang. That the end of the universe was the beginning of the next universe. And so this is being now looked at, and he's got an award, I think, for it, and so forth, for proclaiming this. And so it's just really ho-hum to us in a way, because that's what we've been saying since before the beginning of time. If there was a beginning of a cycle of time, is that everything is just cycling all the time. It's old news to Lord Buddha, who told you to get out of the river of time and sit on the banks and understand this. Get off the wheel of samsara and rebirth and so forth. And to understand these things at a deep level and accept them as the truth. And then spend your time contentedly and be free. Free of wanderings and wanderlust and uncertainties and unsureties that plague the mind until you finally come to a grand conclusion like that. Besides, you put your name on it, a discovery like that, and then it tends to taint it, doesn't it? The seers have been telling us not only physical universes, the Burloka is cycling continually, but it's coming from an origin which is in the next worlds, the inner worlds, the three worlds. So this is a good way to sort of kick off this discourse we're going to hear from Surya Narayan. Om Namo Surya Narayan. Every time the sun comes up, they salute the sun, you see, and it's with some physical pose. But they don't know what they're doing. They're just saluting the physical sun, or do they know the origin of the sun back before the physical universe, and back inside of their own self? The sun of knowledge, the sun of wisdom. Particle from the Sun of Wisdom is a nice book that people should read if they want to understand that deeper. So with that quote, then you can see all the Upanishads that I gathered before and put into the 4 Vedas. The Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Sama Veda, and the Atharva Veda. All of these Vedas are extremely revered, and whole schools have come out of them, and thousands of souls follow these schools and stand behind the wisdom of these ancient rishis that wrote these Upanishads. Many of them, by the way, were not monastics, they were householders. And so there you see, as a star map, where you are. Right here, Akshi Upanishad comes out of the Krishna Yajur Veda. There's the Sukla Yajur Veda. So this Veda, the Yajur Veda, is divided into 2 parts. And the Akshi Upanishad falls there in the Krishna Yajur Veda section. And it falls there along with the Katha Upanishad, which we're familiar with, and with the Taittiriya Upanishad. Because all these underlined Upanishads here are ones that Shankara commented on in 700 AD. So they became the 10, maybe 11, some uncertainty about the Svetashvatara Upanishad, but they became that small collection of Upanishads that Shankara got a hold of. And in the time he had, because he was commenting on the Gita, he was commenting on the Brahma Sutras and the Yoga Sutras we know. So in the time he had, he was giving very deep commentaries on these few Upanishads. So they're pronounced, the major Upanishads they call them now. But we look into a minor Upanishad, we see that that's not really casting any sense of superiority or inferiority over any of the Upanishads. They all have great knowledge of the line, the family that composed them, behind them. So in this particular family, we see the sun god is really a source of origin to trace yourself to. The Manus, the Manus, the 10 Manus, a lot of them trace their origins to the sun god. The solar line, it's called when you read it in English. Some trace it to the lunar line, and others trace it straight to Sri Krishna himself, and so forth. So it's all back inside that their lineage goes, not back in time and not back in space. It's back inside of consciousness, that where these things exist eternally. So that's what Swamiji is saying here. People are getting tired of thinking of the theories of creation out of nothing, which doesn't make sense. Instead, they're coming forth and saying, well, here, how about this? The mind projects everything. Let's contrast that. And the projection is not real to begin with. It's from a seed. And the seed is laying fallow eternally in the mind of God, waiting to be watered by living intelligence so that it will sprout into worlds. And it's all happening. Take all of that I just said and put it in one perfect circle and label it all happening in an eternal moment, if you want. It's all happening in an eternal moment. There's no time passing. No time has passed. You can have darshan right now with all the great souls, or with your family members if you should want to see them again. I'd advise you to go to the former. That's about all I wanted to say about this, because it's not a class on all the Upanishads, but you know which portion of the Veda the Akshi Upanishad has come from now, out of the Yajur Veda, the Krishna Yajur Veda. And then let's give us a little more perspective. And then I'm going to read to you some of the early scriptures, some of the early slokas of the Akshi Upanishad. But first of all, let's look here at this Astika Nastika. That is, pretty much means traditional, non-traditional, as dependent upon the Vedas, or not necessarily taking the Vedas as their authority. Use the words orthodox and unorthodox if you want. But be careful not to draw any conclusion that just because some of the schools of India are not basing their authority strictly on the Upanishads alone, that makes them inferior in any way. That's not the point. It's just that some, and it's explained better by the chart itself here. The first quote here is, basically everyone has borrowed from Mother India throughout long phases of time. As there has been an endless sweep of religions, philosophies, and pathways emanating from her. In other words, not just one sacred book and a single prophet or avatar, but many, many of each. And within this plethora of spiritual avenues, there has always been room for those who profess the existence of divine reality, as well as those who do not care to either admit it or emphasize it. And we see that in the case of beings like Lord Kapila, from what scriptures we have left over from the Samkhya, never mentioned a divine being like an overall God. And Buddhism also stayed away from that. And yoga to a great extent, although Patanjali does have one or two slokas about Ishvara. That is the perfect soul that incarnates amongst us, God in form. But the point being there is that some of the orthodox systems do not accent the existence of God. It's as if it's secondary import. It doesn't really make sense that it doesn't exist because it is existence itself. So India never argued about whether God existed or not. They just talked about the nature of existence and skirted the problem. It was a very unique and somewhat clever philosophical move that otherwise your philosophy begins to run the risks of argumentation and fame, gathering of fame, and debate with no conclusion. So to get to the conclusion is really the purpose of these darshanas, and they all came to a Vedanta Dinima, or a Siddhanta. That was the purpose of starting into the analysis in the first place. It was not just to continue on forever with the analysis, but to get to a conclusion about it and then accept it. And once you accept it, put it on a pedestal, like yoga or Vedanta or Buddhism. And then watch what happens after you idealize it. Idealize the real first, and then that'll help you realize the ideal later. So if there are some faults in religion, and there are, then they will become known through this kind of conclusion that you draw. Otherwise it's all kind of hanging out on the fence that doesn't come to any definitive end. And there's a lot of uncertainty and doubt that occupies the mind through long periods of time. So there you see in the left box in red, the Astika schools, Orthodox systems. They basically admit the existence of God. These are called the Shat Darshanas, that is 6 of them. Samkhya of Lord Kapila, Yoga of Patanjali, of course, Purva Mimamsa of Jaimini, Uttar Mimamsa of Vedavyas, that's the Vedanta which Vivekananda brought to us in 1893 here, and which he wanted accented, and which we are accenting. And then Nyaya of Gautama, that's not Gautama Buddha, by the way, and Vaisheshika of Kannada. So 2 of these are very prominent right now, or more prominent than the others. That's Yoga and Vedanta, although Yoga is beginning to be kind of obscured by the preoccupation with Hatha only, instead of the 8-limbed or 6-limbed they call it sometimes. But along with that, Samkhya is beginning to make a sort of return, because so many of the darshanas were looking at Lord Kapila's system and used it all the way into the Shaivite, who added 12 new steps to it, 36 tattvas. Again, these tattvas is these platforms in which consciousness plays on, and where the koshas and the akashas, get the koshas, 5 of them, put them in an akasha and sport there. If you do that, consciously it's called lila. If you do it unconsciously, it's called dreaming. Mass collective mental dreaming. And the dreaming is accompanied by suffering. with the pleasure. The Leela isn't. It's all bliss, as we can see in Sri Ramakrishna's Leela, or Jesus' Leela, or the Buddha Leela, Rama Leela, Krishna Leela. These lifetimes were wondrous examples to us. The Nastika on the other side, we're moving through it quickly, but this is a good opportunity to give us a grounding in the Vedanta, a kind of additional star map, along with, because Upanishad is Vedanta. Everyone probably has heard me say that many times. Veda, the Vedas, 4 of them. Anta, the end. The end was this period here, where the Upanishads came out. See, we'll get to that in a minute. After they tested it for a long time through songs to God, devotional songs, through rituals, through sacrifices, through forest dwelling, and then they finally wrote it down as an Upanishad. Thousands of them. We only have 108 left, thanks to Vedavyas. That's why he's affectionately called the father of Vedanta. And because he managed at that change of period to hang on to 108 of them because of his facile memory. It's nothing that amazing, because even in this lifetime I saw my teacher recite the entire Gita by heart in his 90s. So divine memory is there, smriti hetu. It goes back in time, back in consciousness, not back in time or to the beginning of space, if there were such a thing. So they're bringing it forth every lifetime, dusting it off, or keeping it polished, as it were, telling it to people. That's a transmission called Guru Parampara. It's one of Shiva's 4 functions, to make sure this wisdom stays current through his Shaktis, 2 of them in that case, and through his devotees, that keeps the wisdom of India, Sanatana Dharma, current and flowing in some quarters, even if it's an underground river for a while it escapes the Romans or escapes Western materialism, or as it hides itself like Mother does. Gives it only to certain people at the right times. The Nastika then, the best word I could think of in India was non-committal as to the existence of God. I didn't want to say that Buddha didn't believe in God, because there's that famous story where his student, Ananda, or one of them, asks Buddha, do you say that God exists? And he said, does God exist? Did I say that God exists? And, so God doesn't exist. Did I say God doesn't exist? So non-committal was his way. And of course, Buddha nature, or Tathagata Garbo, or Pragyaparam was another word that was used, the supreme wisdom, were words for God to Lord Buddha. So he actually had words, and you can find them in some of the more ancient Buddhist scriptures, like the Dhammapada, and he talks about the soul there and the self too. The self, with capital S, is master of the small self. Who else would the self be? So he's affirming consciousness. If you talk about a god, or at a certain time, even Brahman in India's flow of time, then people get turned off to it. See, we've heard enough of it. Should we read it again? People are getting fed up with the superstitions, the same old way of explaining things again, because it didn't lead them to bliss of freedom, to enlightenment. It was circular, so it must still be in that circle of dualities and samsaras. Well, there you see some of these non-orthodox systems in India. Buddhism of Gautama Buddha, and Jainism, which had the 24 Tirthankaras, with Mahavira as the 24th. So we can still know something about the ancient Jainism, which went back, some 24 generations before Buddha was born, with Mahavir on back. So by knowing about Mahavir, which his image is there in the Jain temples, a couple of swamis in India went to the Jain temples and wrote articles in our Nectar of Non-Dual Truth magazine about Jainism. They studied it as Swamis in the Vedanta, Ramakrishna order, and brought up so much valuable information about nonviolence that was many, many generations before Buddhist nonviolence. So this is, again, how to look at these facets of the diamond in India. In this way, we're looking at it as Astika Nastika. And then some scriptures there by classification. You look at all of this, the Shad Darshana, and you look at the unorthodox systems, and you look at their scriptures, and there are many of them, as the quote said up here. But however, they all fall into a kind of threefold classification. Shruti, Smriti, and then kind of Itihasa or Tantras, Puranas. So there's basically a twofold division, but there's the second one divides itself also into two. Shruti is like Vedas, Upanishads, which you see here, and the Bhagavad Gita is figured in as one of the greatest scriptures of India. The Smriti, you see the Itihasa, like means scriptural history, the stories of kings and seers and rishis and queens and street sweepers and thieves and repentant thieves, and the whole thing just goes on with these hundreds and thousands of stories, all with not just a moral to them inside of a worldly context, but with a spiritual meaning, a conclusion that comes with them. So I'd say, that reading about the Ramayana would be much different than, say, Aesop's fairy tables or something. Aesop's fairy tales. See? Because there's this deep spiritual element and content in them. There you see also the Tantras, the Darshanas, the Dharma Shastras. There could be more words you could add to these of classifications of scriptures in India. So you look at them sort of as non-dual, qualified non-dual, and dual, is how Swami Vivekananda said is my new discovery for this age, is that there are three platforms of philosophy, and people graduate them, and then some beings can go back and forth between the three. For instance, he was asked when he returned from his great success in America, whether by some Brahmin priest asked him, well, are you a non-dualist or are you a dualist? You see, there he is worshipping Sri Ramakrishna as his guru, and there he is preaching non-duality from the platform of Advaita, and having to teach Westerners who are materialistic, so having to come down to that level to talk to intellectuals and try and convince him of something more than just matter. So he was in quite a position there in his lifetime in the late 1800s and mid 1800s to early 1900s. He came twice to the West in that period. So when he was asked, when he got back to India after he brought us these scriptures, are you a non-dualist or a dualist? He said, I'm a dualist as long as I'm here in this body. And as soon as I leave it, I'll be a non-dualist. So he very interesting way of answering this Brahmin priest who was sort of trying to trap him into one way of being, when, I would say he could have added, and also between the two, when I'm teaching, I'm a qualified non-dualist, see. So, because you have to, when you speak with the Dharma, you're coming down from the non-dual platform, and you can come down as far as dualism, like Itihasa and so forth, to teach that. And that because people at that level need that. You can't pull the rug out from under people, Holy Mother said, just because you're a non-dualist and have understood the heights of Advaita and so forth. Pragyaparam, have you experienced Nirvikalpa or Nirvana? You have to come back down and help people at the level that they understand things. It's kind of a rule of thumb. The part I really wanted to get to here in this preamble, this is actually taking the place of my verbal preamble, to have an opportunity to reintroduce the Akshi Upanishad so that we know where we're, like I say, the star map, we know where the grounding comes from, what's around us as scenery in space and time. And the Vedas too get divided. So all of these 108 get divided in half into two divisions. One's karma kanda and one's jnana kanda. So there are those who are active and karma, they have to know how to do their duties and their actions and morality and ethics and yamas and niyamas. All of that would be sort of their focus in order to live a dharmic life. And then there are those who are courting formlessness. That's the jnana kanda's business, is to help people transcend nature and form. And I think, where else do you hear that even said? What do you mean? Is what you would question in any other religion. What do you mean formlessness? What do you mean being one with the Father? I mean, they could have probably and did question Jesus about that. It sounds like an egotistic statement, but that aside, if that's not even the issue, is this total lack of understanding about formlessness. Yet they're in deep sleep every night, experiencing the light of consciousness in formlessness. But to have a desire to be formless, it's like a contradiction to itself. A desire means form. The Rig Veda even says so. Everything's based on desire. So it's just a matter of what the level of desire is. It's desire for things and all that. Oh, that's an old story. We know about that. But it's desire to be free, mumukshutvam. Then come with me, young man. The rest of you go see the temples, you see. Come with me and we'll talk about this desire you have for formlessness and what's at the foundation of it. Because there is a lot at the foundation of it. It can be talked around in a very high level. So, and Shankara said so. Here's this great quote: Yo Vedabhyaha Akhilam Jagat Nirmanane. God created the entire universe out of the knowledge of the Vedas. So here is the knowledge of the Vedas at a more recent time, in Vedavyasa's time, 108 of testaments on higher knowledge. And the Upanishads contain in them all three levels of teaching, focused on the non-dual, very much emphasizing the qualified non-dual, and then using the dual to explain the upper two tiers. So there you see under Karmakanda a sort of history of India as we knew it in time. That is, Samhitas, Brahmanas, and Aranyakas. So you see there, in the earliest time, there were collections of mantras and hymns. And if you want to make another association, this corresponds to the Brahmacharya stage, when you learn the hymns and the mantras and so forth. And probably would have to say compose them too, or pull them out of your memory. It's just another thing about artists, which I've been with all my life, and I don't know if I'd ever want to be born an artist again in any shape or form, because of how they think and what they do with their art. It's so much based in the personality and in the ego and success, and like every other thing. So it's a little distasteful, but if you are at a brahmacharya phase of life, which is your young phase of life, then that's going to be consummate with hymns, right? That's music, isn't it? So you're composing music. You're drawing music from inside of you that's already been composed before and putting a new face on it and presenting it to who? To people so they can enjoy it over dinner or drinks, or to God as an offering, a free given offering to the soul. So that's what you would spend your time doing, and your celibacy and the energy you're gathering from celibacy, putting it into this composition, these songs, these hymns. And some of them would come out as mantras. They'd be so powerful. As a musician, I could say there's some forms of music that I consider mantras without words. They really lead the mind to a higher place beyond notes and beyond scales and beyond movements and keys and rhythms and all of that that's a part of music. Which means some composers drew something very deep out of their mind because they were very dedicated to the divine principle. But in case of India, it was pretty much clearly marked. The Samhitas were the first phase of time, that this had to be done. The second phase, sacrificial rites, duties, and modes of conduct. This is consummate with the Grihastha stage, or you're making a living, kind of merchant stage. You'll see. So you had to do that, and your sacrificial rites were of particularly import then, because you did your homa, fire, and you did your pujas, and all these mantras then became pronounced and accented and refined to a great extent. And then you went into life, your duties, making money, and your modes of conduct, ethics were very important. And there was a long period of that you did rites and rituals. So you can't possibly put all the rites and rituals in books nowadays. There's just too many of them. So many of them have never been translated into English or other languages. They had to stay in the Sanskrit. And pretty much it's a lore that's understood only by Brahmin priests who have had families, been born in families of Brahmin priests for many, many hundreds of years or lifetimes. All of this passing by then, a stage or phase came when the Aranyakas came into prominence. That's inner meaning of what you just did, like rites and rituals. If you want to put it in an anthropomorphical way of saying, you did these, probably at the beginning you did these offerings to nature spirits. Like we're about to read about Akshi, the sun god. So in a physical sun, he'd be a sun god. And some of the cultures in recent time, not too distant time, have worshipped him as a physical sun god. In India, the worship of Surya, or the Sauryas they're called, they worship what's behind the sun, what gives us its power to shine and its power to be. So I'm bringing that up in context to if you do enough rites and rituals, then you begin to see behind the scenes, behind what the meaning of earth, trees, mountains, and so forth, like the Advaita did in his meditations, taking 24 teachers in nature. And you begin to see behind the meaning of water and why it flows and how it purifies and all its meanings, and fire and air, and eventually even ether, empty space. Not just on a physical level, but then many levels, 4 more levels of space, another 5-fold level of quintuplication you have to look into to find out the origins of things. Energy, not just kinetic and electric, as we say, but energy of prana, that you don't live by bread alone, there's another energy in everything. And then also back into the mind and its thinking process, and then in intelligence, which is extremely important to the whole game, as far as these darshanas here are concerned. Intelligence is very high on the scale, like the first compound of consciousness, to quote Vivekananda. So because of seeing all this, when you did your offerings of songs to the gods and to the Lord, and to the Mother and so forth, and you did your rites and rituals around them too, you would actually go out in the forest and start a fire and sit there and spend part of the night offering things into it and doing mantras, and this is what people did. Not just in temples, but in the forest. So it was then not hard to see why forest dwelling became more prominent. That's the third stage of thing called the vanaprasthan. These beings had made their money, had their children, raised them, and now they wanted to retire from life. And they were headed to a sannyas, towards a sannyas stage, but they didn't do it from early in life. Like even nowadays, most the young men and women will come to the Indian mats and temples and so forth and get their initiation into brahmacharya and then jump these two phases, see, and just become sannyasins right away. So that wasn't uncommon, but it was probably a kind of unique type of soul who was able to do that. They didn't have the desire for rites and rituals, didn't have the desire for forest dwelling. Why bother? Let's go cut to the chase and just be celibate and reserve our energies, store them up like yogically, and then wait for the realization of the divine being to dawn upon our minds. So the Vanaprasthan stage was otherwise available for beings as they went slowly more towards that goal. So there were rules for forest dwellers, and they followed them, usually husband and wife alone in the woods, or sometimes maybe if they were widowed or didn't have a partner, then they would go themselves and build huts out of leaves and stuff and stay in the woods and be quiet, not speak, meditate on the Lord, and also prepare themselves for leaving the body. It's not very common thinking to us nowadays that, oh gee, I'm 80 or 90, not going to last much longer, I better prepare myself. It probably would have been better if you had have prepared yourself from year one, or from dharmic parents, or when you first had the desire to be free, mumukshutvam, but you didn't do that. Some grandparents took their grandchildren to a Swami once, and the grandparents loved the Swami. They were huddling at his feet, laughing. They loved him so much, his purity, his simplicity and everything. And so when they were leaving, the Swami overheard the kids saying, "We want to be like him, we want to be like him." And the grandparents said, "Oh no, there's time for you to be like him. Right now you have to make yourself, you have to live your life and be successful and everything. Take care of us," and all that. And so the Swami later on told his students about this story and says, "Yeah, but they were telling him, that they could wait till later on to be like me. But look at them. These grandparents, they're still stuck in this round of raising children and making money and habitual conventional life. And are they being like the Swami by the time they're old?" You probably would want to be like that great being or those great beings you follow right away. Be thee perfect as the Father in heaven is perfect. The minute you heard that as a young Christian person, you would be devoted to Christ. And that devotion to Christ wouldn't mean that you only went to church once a week, or to temple once a week, or on pilgrimage once a year, or fast once a year. Those are austerities that are cheap bribes as far as the gods of enlightenment are concerned. You would want to commit yourself 100% right then while the getting's good, and then live a life in freedom, live in yoga. Get back your consciousness from the world if you'd invested it there and it's become cheapened and tarnished. As Buddha said, the rest of monasteries is the non-recitation of scriptures. The rest of households is the lack of spiritual self-effort. So if you're in a household, which these beings are, starting out as a brahmacharya with their parents, young stage, then being a merchant and so forth, and then coming forth and by the time your forest dwelling stage is upon you, then this would be something that you should have enacted a long time ago and carry through. And the carrying through leads itself to jnana kanda. That's where the karma kanda portion of life falls behind, and the jnana kanda becomes important. Vivekananda brought us the Vedanta in 1893, and I remember talking to a Swami once, the Ramakrishna order, and And how are we going to go through all these phases to get to sannyas? Oh, you're already Brahmins. All of you here are already Brahmins, he said. You don't have to go through these phases. Take sannyas now. Or become Vedantas, and that will be a kind of sannyas for you. You can give up the world through neti neti right now. It's upon you. You're a higher class of soul, right? And so be noble and realize that. Of course, it's going to be a question yet unanswered, and time will tell whether or not America can embrace such a great tradition as Vedanta. There are forms of it like Zen and Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism and so forth, that are coming forth, that are helping prepare people for non-duality. And so there are several forms of Advaita sort of vying for supremacy. That's a direct quote from Vivekananda in 1902. But we'll see which one takes the fore. He says, because my feeling is that Advaita, Vedanta, will take the fore. It might take some several hundred years, but it's going to be the future religion of mankind, he said. So under the Jnana Kanda, we're led back here, full circle to the Upanishads. So let me say real quickly that when you were involved in the Samhitas and the Brahmanas and the Aranyakas, you were probably studying these levels here of scripture. But and the Shruti may not have been something that you heard and understood or accented. But when you get to the Jnana Karma, it can't be sidestepped. The non-dual scriptures are something that immediately must be heard, or if you've heard them already, must be questioned. Atma Vichara. The questioning is around the nature, the true nature of being, or the self, the Atman with a capital S, not around any other thing. You sharpen your mind with thoughts on reality alone, and then you take that and understand it. That's why we sing sometimes. Danur grihitva upanishadam mahastram Hyupasanasita sanjayita ayamya tad bhavakatena chetasha laksham tadivaksharam somya vidhi om. That follows this same rites and rituals, started it all off. And they were, later became Upanishads through experience. But the Upanishads are eternal and contained them in the first place, before the Samhitas phase kicked in. Everything is eternal. And so there's nothing new under the sun, as Ecclesiastes said. Everything that happened before will happen again. Everything that's happening now will happen again. And it's all cyclic. Those who want to get off of cycles, then they come to the Jnana Kanda, and they start understanding non-duality. Quick, you must. And there are some of us in the West, thanks to Vivekananda's visit, and the Swamis that followed him, which are doing that. That's Vedanta for you right there. It's really focusing in on this hearing, Shruti, and then implementing. See, Shravana Manana Nididhasana. Many of you know what I mean by that. So here it says, secret teaching for those ready to renounce the world. It's not secret because we're keeping it from other people, because Vivekananda wanted it spread from door to door. But just try going door to door with something like this and see if there's even any faint interest in it. What to speak of any understanding or any remembrance of the truth echoing back in those canyonless walls of human consciousness. So you don't spread pearls before swine. You don't kick a dead horse. You put it out there as best you can and see who comes forward. And then be ready for half of those to desert it as you teach them about it, not ready for it. and then start specifying with a few people. I mean, that's basically what 12 apostles or 16 direct disciples or the Noble Eight of Buddha, that's what that's all about. Well, here I told you, how many of you are going to stay around and realize this truth? By the way, this truth is eternal. I'm not putting my name on it. In India, it's always and ever present and just recedes behind and then comes forward at certain times. I'll show you how to recognize it when it comes forward. Wait for it, they say, right? It's like about pressing the switch for the atom bomb. Okay, we're all watching, wait for it. So the guru will tell you about that. It's coming. I see the signs of it. You see, it's just like fishing for a big fish. Fisherman watches the float for the longest time, doesn't deviate at all, even when someone's insulting him from the road. You see, you're not speaking to me. What are you, stuck up? But he won't divert his attention from that float. And finally, he sees it just a little bit tip. He yanks, and he goes home to eat his meal. So that kind of concentration is necessary for the spiritual process. You watch like an Eskimo watches for signs in the snow. To study snow is the Eskimo's business each day. This is a Zen way of putting that teaching. So it's a secret teaching for those ready to renounce the world. And I just want to say that to preface that with it's secret, not because we're trying to keep it from people. We'd love to spread it around. It's secret because they themselves are keeping it secret from themselves, just like they're keeping the existence of God secret from themselves and the existence of their self from themselves. And the relationship and the unity of God and self from themselves too. I mean, this is what was being taught to you here in so many ways. 108 times how many mentions of the relationship between God and the soul in every sloka of the Upanishads? How many ways is that to explain to you the perfection of your true nature? So this corresponds with the sannyas stage, and we're very fortunate nowadays. I was just thinking about it. I think about it quite often. Where are my real friends? The swamis have been my real friends. And it's not a friendship that most people would want because you hardly ever see them and they'll hardly ever speak to you. But I look amongst the West, I don't like suits and ties, intellectuals, and runs of common thinking, and repeating the same mistakes over and over again based in violence, greed, money-making, fame. I don't like that. I never have. When I see these peaceful beings who have renounced the world, I like that. Make me like them. Let me have company with them, even if they don't talk to me for days. Fine. Soaking in the vibration here. So, who are your true friends? Are they fair faces and false hearts, friends? That's what Vivekananda said about most people he knew. He said, most of the atheists I met in America were better candidates for the Vedanta than people who profess to believe in God. That's how dim things have gotten, you see, when you believe in fantastic, unacceptable things. So we can finish this half of Upanishadic Vedic grounding, which is good to do finally, by this quote. And it's a story. Now, this would be more like a combination of Upanishad and Itihasa, you see here. They will use non-duality in a story. That's beautiful. It's better than morality or ethics or fables, even metaphors and analogies, unless they have a meaning behind them. So this story, Lord Brahma was once meditating on his whole creation, that is, everything that got projected out of the great seeds of his own great mind, when there was manifest within the shrine of his heart the eternal word. All of a sudden, he heard the Om that he made everything out of. It's sort of like, gee, it's not always there to hear. All of a sudden it comes upon you. Your tongue sticks to the roof of your mouth. Your eyes go up in your head. The hair stands on the end of your arms. Your flesh horripulates. These are how Ramakrishna described it. The seed of all knowledge and thought surfaced to him. Why? Because he was meditating on this creation that came out of him. See how even a great God of the Trinity would say, "Oh, look at that." Sit back in satisfaction and just see this. But just contemplating of that all of a sudden makes me think of its origin, the Word, which was in the beginning and was with God, but then it was one with God too. So one by one, then came the sounds of all the letters to him. And through these letters there became known to him the wisdom of the Vedas. Things that disappear after you've used them come back later, like a musician playing a beautiful piece of music and then later sitting thinking, gee, I could never have played that if I hadn't have learned my D major scale and my G major scale and my F minor scale when I was a practitioner. How to use notes and everything. It's the same with words. They're like notes in a symphony. And they each have their own part to play and they each have their own essence, and you can't do without any one of them. It's a mundamala. It's a garland of letters, they call it. Garland of alphabets. Varna, it's called in India. That would be back to your tantric teachings. Sadakya, the sixfold way of how Brahman works its way into these tattvas and these worlds. Basically happens through deities and through words that are associated with them, mantras, alphabets, letters. So this all came back to Lord Brahma. He then taught it to his disciples, and these in turn spread it through the many worlds. The power of the word. And then you want to take apart the mantras, that is each letter, and then you want to see what's inside each letter, that there are particles of intelligence that make up the letter. And for that, of course, you'll be leaving the comfortable climes of intellectualism, the intellectual frame of reference, and how you learn the alphabet and recite it backwards and forwards and learn to spell words from it without ever knowing the meaning in it all. That words were the whole reason that you're there. That words and letters and their seeds are what makes up everything in you. You think it's atoms, but actually it was words. It was letters. It was intelligence that was behind the atom and congealing it and pulling it back apart again at the end of your life. These are things you should be doing consciously. In the remaining minutes, which are not a lot before the break, we can look at the Akshi Upanishad chart that I made. And I was putting it across the board from the 8 limbs of yoga this time. Because these are the 7 stages of yoga in Vedanta, and these are the 8 limbs of yoga in Patanjali. So it was beautiful reading the Akshi Upanishad to find out that there was another kind of tiered system on yoga, and this was the Vedic version of it. You could see probably why Vedavyas, who gathered the Akshi Upanishad as one of the 108 that he saved at the end of that period, was later to write a commentary on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. It's very famous to put those two side by side, and I have a chart for that too. But in this way, probably what interested a great Vedic seer like that in the Vedantic period, not the Vedic period, but in the Vedantic period, what interested him was, gee, look at that. The sun god is telling about 7 stages of yoga. It sort of reminds me of the 8 limbs of yoga that my good friend there, my buddy Patanjali, composed back in 140 AD. So this is partly for review too, if we look at this. And in fact, before I review it, I told you I was going to read it to you, so that with the remaining 10 minutes or so we have, let me catch you up, because my markings here in my copy had it when we were in Portland back in January, February, before we couldn't go there anymore because of this pandemic thing. And we had stopped around sloka 24. So I'm going to read you the first 24 slokas. And I'm going to try my best not to stop to comment on any of them, because things pop up in my mind when I read this. Of course, it all starts out with Sahana Bhavatu, Sahana Bhunaktu as the peace chant. And then part 1 of the Upanishad. Then the blessed Samkriti, he's a rishi, repaired to the solar world by going inside, meditating. Bowing down to the sun, he glorified the sun by science of the wise. He said, Om, salutation to the blessed Lord, the glorious sun, to the power of the eye. Salutation to the sky wanderer. Salutation to the commander of the army of light. Salutation to darkness, parens, excessive light. Salutation to energy, salutation to light. Giving us a clue there as to the different levels of light and fire. Then another peace chant, or another chant, Asato Ma Satkamoya, comes in. Lead me from the unreal to the real. And then onwards with these slokas in the first section. Of the essence of purity, the Blessed One scorches the sins of the sinful. The blessed swan of the essence of purity is the prototype of the jiva who is bound. Here rises the sun, thousand-rayed, existent in myriad ways, the life of all animate beings. I meditate on that one who is omniform, compassionate, omniscient, ambrosial, of the essence of light, the scorcher. Salutation to the blessed Lord, the sun, the offspring of the infinite, the power of the eye, who grants us our flood of days. The flood, all hail, all hail. Unquote, really. Then our rishi goes on, thus glorified by the means of the science of the wise, the Lord in the form of the sun was highly gratified. He said, whichever Brahmana studies without break this science of the wise never contracts any eye disease. None is born blind in his family. Teaching this to 8 Brahmanas, one becomes perfect in this science. Whosoever knows this is magnified. Then the second section comes on, part 2. Then Samkriti, who is now in front of the sun god inside, said, Blessed One, teach me Brahmavidya. He's not waiting at all for mincing of words or anything. The sun god then told him, Samkriti, listen. I shall set forth the knowledge of reality, so hard to come by which knowledge alone you will become liberated while living in the body. Sanskrit word jivanmukti. Sloka 2. All in one, all is one, unborn, tranquil, endless, certain, immutable. See reality as spirit, be tranquil and at ease. I think Samkriti would have been happy just to hear that and go back to his body on earth. It's my favorite sloka of all of them. All is one, unborn, tranquil, endless, certain, immutable. Sounds like Gaudapada to me. See reality as spirit, be tranquil and at ease. Sloka 3. The adepts know yoga to be the non-knowing of plurality, the spontaneous attrition of the object-seeking mind. Rooted in yoga, perform all actions, or, averse to actions, perform them not at all. For aversion is felt every day to inborn tendencies to act. Nevertheless, one tends to plunge into noble actions with gusto. Always one hesitates as regards to instinctive actions of the unregenerate, but never refers to what may compromise others, and attends to their righteous deeds. One does gentle deeds that pain none, always dreads sin and avoids all forms of sense gratification. The speech of such a one is informed by affection and love. It is lovely and fit, with due regard to time and place. With proper thought, act, and speech, one waits upon the virtuous. Getting them from all conceivable sources, one studies the Shastras from them. That's the scriptures. Then one attains the first stage of yoga. Now I'll point you here to the chart. One attains to the first stage of yoga. Whosoever entertains such thoughts as regards the crossing of transmigratory life is said to have attained a state of yoga. The rest are said to be just noble. So that's my second favorite sloka. That is, crosses transmigratory life. That would be the first stage in yoga. Done with it. It cuts very high. It's a very high declaration for the 7 stages. Coming to the next stage of yoga, called vichara, the sadhaka resorts to the foremost scholars, well known for their serious interpretations of shruti and smriti. Look back to this chart for that if you want. Kinds of scriptures. Good conduct, fixed attention, contemplation, and activities. As a householder knows his homestead, so having mastered all that is to be learned, the sadhaka comes to know the categories, the doctrines, vis-a-vis what has to be done and what has to be avoided. As a snake sheds its slough, so sheds he even a slight attachment to external objects when they are intensified by pride, conceit, intolerance, greed, and delusion. With a mind disciplined through devotion to the scriptures, teachers, and the company of the virtuous, he then truthfully masters the entire body of knowledge, including the secret doctrines. Again, the Jnanakanda is secret, right? As we said. Just as a lover repairs to a spotless bed of flowers, from the second the sadhaka proceeds to the third state, styled non-attachment. There's on the chart here, 1, 2, and 3, those steps simply put. Fixing his steady mind on the truthful import of the scriptures and busy with the recitation of spiritual texts proper to the hermitages of ascetics, he expends his life seated on a bed of stone or a slab, diverting himself with ramblings in the forest made beautiful by his own placid mind. As a result of his meritorious actions, the righteous sadhaka passes his time in the delights of detachment, repeatedly studying the positive shastras. One's perception of reality becomes clear in due course of time. The enlightenment, reaching the third stage, experiences this for himself. For non-attachment is of 2 kinds. Listen to the distinction as it is being drawn. This non-attachment is of 2 kinds, one general, the other superior. The general non-attachment is non-involvement in objects, based on the perception, I am neither agent nor enjoyer, neither sublator nor sublated. Everything, be it pleasure and pain, is fashioned by prior deeds. Or, everything is under the sway of the Lord. I do nothing in regard to it. Enjoyments and non-enjoyments are dread diseases. Possessions are great disasters. All contacts just promote separation. Sufferings are diseases of thoughts. Time is ceaselessly fashioning all things. So the general non-attachment of the sadhaka, who has grasped the import of the major texts, consists in being averse to all things and in not dwelling on them mentally. By cultivating this sequence of stages, 3 so far, the superior non-attachment in the case of the magnanimous seeker supervenes. It is said to be silence, repose and quiescence, for speech and import have been flung far away in the light of the truth. The truth being, I am no agent, the agent is God, or my own prior actions. So the first 25 or 26 slokas of the Akshi Upanishad pack a punch for us, lots to look back on. And these are recorded in our on our SRV site. You can look back and look at the previous Akshi Upanishad classes that dealt with all 25 of those slokas. I did it so with different charts like I'm doing here. But this then allows us to look back to where we ended up in last January and find out that we had looked really pretty much at the first 3 stages of yoga. Basically, you must cross transmigratory life, you must study with a acharya then, and then achieve non-attachment. It's put in very simple ways. When we come back from the break, we can look at what the first limbs of yoga are like and draw a comparison. So here we have started well grounded in the Vedanta and the tradition into our restudy or continuing study of the Akshi Upanishad with Surya Narayan, the sun god. We'll go on with that after we return from our break.